with you today with the overall badging of resilience is really biodiversity. I want to get towards the end, explaining what we're doing on biodiversity in a new piece of legislation that I expect to be introducing shortly to Parliament. But on the way through, just to explain the relationship between biodiversity and climate change and, of course, our resilient response that's required. To start with, I'll just show you I should have looked at this earlier, I think the green button's probably right. So this is the way that a lot of people are starting to see the connections between what's going on with nature and what's going on with climate change. It's the sort of thing that occasionally is piercing through the media wall. This first slide shows Picaninny Ponds. On the right-hand side, that's what Picaninny Ponds ought to look like. It's one of the great wonders of the world. It is deep, deep, clear water down in the southeast. People come from around the world to dive in it, and it is at the heart of a wetland that supports innumerable species, but particularly a number of rare and endangered species. The photograph on the left is what Picaninny Ponds looks like right now. And the reason it looks like that is multifactorial, but essentially not enough water is going through Picaninny to sustain cleaning it out. A load of nutrients arrived. It was full of algae mats, tons and tons, hauled out by the Environment Department. And all of the wonderful vegetation that you can see on the right is now gone. And for those who don't care about the loss of a tourism icon, the threatened destruction of the species that are dependent on that ecosystem functioning, it also is doing a job of holding back seawater, because the water flows out from the southeast of South Australia. Is very wet usually. It's been experiencing an extraordinary dry recently. And as that water doesn't flow out at the right pace, there is a serious threat that seawater will start to intrude back in and make the groundwater on which all people, all primary production depends, go salty. Another example of the challenge of climate change and biodiversity that's made it through to the media recently is, of course, the algal bloom of Karinia mikimotoi. This algal bloom is around the size of Kangaroo Island. In parts, it's as deep as 20 or 25 metres. It's a naturally occurring organism, a dinoflagellate, that has got out of control in its growth and is seeing a lot of marine life washing up dead. Scientists will study this, but it is extremely likely that the fact that we've had a marine heat wave, which you can see in the top right, has contributed to that. A marine heat wave that's been going for some time, doesn't look like diminishing, added to which we have this ongoing pattern of highs, which means that there's no wind, there's no big wave action, and it's just not breaking up. And we're increasingly getting public interest in the destruction of nature that's occurring as a result of this, as well as, of course, fishers, agriculture being deeply concerned about their livelihood. So people out in the public are starting to see this correlation between what's happening to the climate, what's happening to nature, and their own interests, and that is essential. But of course, the problems with biodiversity are not limited to the relatively recent phenomenon of human-driven climate change. And while climate has varied before, let's not forget that one of the features of climate change that humans have produced is its pace. So where nature might be able to adapt over a period of thousands of years, it's very hard to adapt over a period of decades. But to remind you, of course, what most of you will know well, we have got an extinction crisis that would be occurring without climate change. It's just that it's exacerbated by climate change. And this is one of the many ways to illustrate that. So if we look at what happened with wild animals, wild mammals moved into metric tonnes, so finding an equivalent way of measuring the weight. And you can see that while there are many, many, many more mammals now in modern times, the vast majority of them are livestock and humans, and the wild mammals has become a vanishingly small metric tonnage than it was before we invented agriculture and our population started to grow, intensify, and our demands on the earth became as heavy as they are now. So that's the bad news. We also, though, need biodiversity if we're going to solve or start to address climate change. Biodiversity is deeply bound up in the answers we have before us to help us mitigate the worst effects of climate change. But let me talk to you first about the Australian story. Yesterday, one of the speakers spoke about the book Collapse by Jared Diamond. It's a terrific book, and the fact that it was brought up again yesterday reminded me to go back and reread towards the end. There's a magnificent chapter that tries to pull together all the case studies of why various cultures over time have collapsed and why some haven't, and what the features of addressing problems as they arise are that might help guide us with this most recent one. Why is it that some cultures collapse in the face of challenges, is what he asks. The first problem is a failure to anticipate that there is a problem. And that is usually through a combination of ignorance and false analogy. And he literally uses Australia as an example of this. So when Europeans arrived here, Europeans made two fundamental, although entirely understandable, errors. The first was that they, in their ignorance, assumed, looking at our environment, that it was a really resilient, tough environment, because it looks hardy. And they thought that they needed to beat it back into submission in order to be able to live here. And of course, actually, the vast majority of our environment is incredibly precarious, particularly in a dry state like South Australia, where the topsoil is thin, where the margins of productivity are slight. But it was an understandable error made of ignorance. There was also the second problem of the false analogy, thinking that this was a land that could be turned into European-like land. That if we brought to bear European attitudes and European approaches, that we would be able to shape it into being like Europe. But of course, that was wrong. So what we did, as an inheritor of European culture, was we cleared as hard as we could. In fact, we didn't just suggest that people clear. We said you can only have land if you do broad-scale clearing. We used water sources as if they were limitless. We introduced monoculture. We introduced species like deer and foxes and rats and rabbits as if they were familiar and comforting creatures that we could share this land with, rather than they would become the scourges of the resilience of our nature. We have recognised that that was an error. We have seen that that was wrong. And our response has been a good and strong one. In South Australia in particular, we have a magnificent series of pieces of legislation that put a stop to most of the poor decision-making that was born of that first error that Jared Diamond talks about, the error of failure to anticipate. We have learned from that. The National Parks and Wildlife Act, the NRM Act that became landscapes, that prescribed water sources and said, if it looks like it might run out, we probably should put a ring around it and work out how much can be allocated rather than assuming it's limitless. We brought in the Environment Protection Act, 30 years old this year. We no longer allow industry, when they've got a bit of pollution to dig a hole and shove it in, which is really what we used to do. So we have brought in, and importantly, we brought in the Native Vegetation Act that put a final full stop on ending broad-scale clearance and said native vegetation is precious. If we're going to clear it, we need to have an offset, significant environment benefit, but by the way, you shouldn't clear most of it anymore. Not all states have yet caught up to the strength of our Native Vegetation Act. So we did a good job in that. But there are other errors that Jared Diamond talks about that humans have fallen into over time that we need to learn from. Even once a problem starts, the second category is a failure to perceive that it started. That might be because we literally don't have the technological capacity to recognise what's occurring. It might mean that there are remote managers, people making decisions that are a long way from where the problem is starting to occur. We have traces of that problem in the way that we structure government and the way we structure corporations. And then there is the challenge that is particularly acute when it comes to climate change in the recent past, which is that when you have an experience of fluctuation, it's sometimes hard to see the trend. So we're a country that goes through droughts. I still hear people in Parliament, when I talk about climate change, shout out, oh, well, we've always had droughts. Sure, we've always had droughts. Look at the trends, understand the significance of the trends. But that fluctuation has caused challenges for people before, cultures before, that have collapsed. What we need to do about that is get a lot better at science, at relentless and remorseless data collection. As the Premier said yesterday, I was beaming with his exhortation for us to listen to science, to use science wisely. The failure to perceive is a problem of failure to get out there and measure and then understand what that's telling us. And then there's this big problem that Jared Diamond talks about, which is the failure to act even when you know there's a problem. And boy, is Western culture guilty of that. And you'd think it was completely irrational. It's one thing that Western culture's good at, it's at reason. But the fact is that we are not well set up to make smart decisions collectively, particularly not when it requires sacrifice for some without immediate benefit. And that is one of the examples that Jared Diamond uses as cultures that have gone before, that have collapsed, have not been good at recognising clash of interests. It's also a challenge when there is this tragedy of the commons, where no one really feels that they have an ownership. And guess what? That's where government has to come in, because government is, at its best, collective ownership and collective will on behalf of the people. But it doesn't always exercise it sufficiently well. And there is, and I look at the United States and I despair, the additional challenge of when elites are able to feel that they can insulate themselves from a collapse that is occurring. The problem that may not have been anticipated but has been perceived is known to be happening, but they think that they can insulate themselves and therefore have no stake in altering the course, despite the elites having the most power to do that. We mustn't fall into that trap, either with climate change or with biodiversity. So are we failing to act on biodiversity and its interaction with climate change in South Australia? Well, of course we are. No one would say that we're doing a perfect job and we can all just go home and finish this conference and go for an early lunch. But we are recognising the very great opportunity before us to do things differently, to do things better, to learn how to better perceive the problem through using science and sharing information, and to actually create the architecture to make a difference. Now, I don't usually like to put words up, but I'm going to put the magnificent Ken Henry's words up there. Ken Henry came and talked to my cabinet